Good afternoon. Welcome to B-Sides Las Vegas, a ground truth track. This talk is weeding out living off the land attacks at scale, given by, oh God, I forgot your name, by Adarsh. A few announcements before we begin. We'd like to thank our sponsors, especially our diamond sponsors, LastPass and Palo Alto Networks, our gold sponsors, Amazon, Invisium, and Google. It is their support, along with our other sponsors, donors, and volunteers that make this event possible. These talks are being streamed live, except in Underground Track. And as a courtesy to our speakers and audience, we ask that you check to make sure that your cell phones are sent to silent or vibrate. If you have a question, we're actually doing questions at the end. If you do have one, use this microphone that I'm standing at in the middle of the room so YouTube can hear you. As a reminder, the BSidesLV photo policy prohibits taking pictures without the explicit permission of everyone in frame. These talks are all being recorded and will be available on YouTube in the future, again, with the exception of Underground. Of course, please keep your mask on at all times. If you want to move closer to the middle of the room, please keep social distancing in mind as well. With that, let's get started. Welcome, Adarsh.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? All the way at the back? All right, sounds good. So hi, everyone. I'm Adarsh. I'm a research manager at Sophos AI, and today I'll be talking about weeding out living off the land attacks at scale. So a little bit about me. I have been working at the intersection of security and machine learning for, is it cutting out? I feel like it's cutting out. Okay. Okay. Sorry about that. So I've been working at the intersection of data science and machine learning for 4.5 years. All of that has been at Sophos AI. I joined right out of grad school. I completed a master's degree in computer science with a specialization in artificial intelligence and machine learning at UC San Diego. Currently, I live in Denver with my dog, and I'm originally from India. I grew up in Bangalore and moved to the US for grad school. So before I begin talking about the technical details of this talk, I'd like to mention that the work that went behind this talk is a huge collaborative effort across several teams in Sophos AI. This involves data scientists, data engineers, threat analysts, software engineers, and program managers. And I'd like to take a minute to acknowledge their contributions and thank them for it. Anyway, now let's get to the technical specifics. What is this talk about? This talk details the development of a machine learning system that detects living off the land binary attacks. This system is supposed to be another detector or sensor that feeds alerts into the security operations center. If you attended Ben's talk yesterday, Ben Gelman from Sophos AI, you got some context on how we have different sensors that feed alerts into our security operations center, and how these alerts are manually then reviewed by our SOC analysts. So we look into the technical details of how we designed this system that surfaces living off the land binary attack alerts, the challenges we faced during the development of the system, the strategies we used to mitigate them, and finally, the generic lessons that we learned along the way. If you attended Josh's talk yesterday, you'll remember this slide. Spoiler alert, I come to pretty much the same conclusion at the end of this talk, but I just take a different path. I use this project as kind of a case study to demonstrate each of these points that he made yesterday. Okay, so what are the goals of this system? Because it's important to define the goals before we start working on it. So the first goal is to surface additional living off the land attacks to the security operations center that are not yet being detected by existing methodologies. But more importantly, the second goal is, since this system is going to surface alerts to a security operations center, it's not supposed to be flooding the SOC with alerts, especially not false positive alerts. Now that we have the goals squared away, let's move on to understanding the actual problem. What are living off the land binary attacks? Living off the land attacks, or LOLBIN attacks in short, are attacks that involve the use of binaries that are either pre-installed by the user in a system or existing system binaries. These binaries are used in a malicious way, and that's what constitutes a LOLBIN attack. And in general, the attack vector for this attack is a command line that is executed against said binary. These attacks tend to be extremely hard to detect and defend against for many reasons. Some of which are that they have a very small footprint on the user system. Sometimes it's really hard to differentiate between like legitimate sysadmin activity and LOLBIN attacks, and yeah, several other reasons. So our problem is that we want to detect LOLBIN attacks with machine learning. So is this a good nail for the hammer of machine learning? In order to determine whether this is a good candidate solution to be solved by machine learning, we need a couple of things. We've established that the artifact that we can use to detect a LOLBIN attack is usually the command line that is executed. So we need a lot of representative command line data that is very similar in distribution to the actual command line data that we'll be predicting against. Second, we need a lot of good labels for this data. In order to teach a machine learning model what is a malicious command and what is a benign command, we need to have plenty of examples that span a wide variety of use cases. Well, the first problem is not really an issue because working at a large security vendor, we have plenty of access to the actual distribution of command line data that we'll be predicting against. In this work, we mainly focus on detecting and surfacing alerts to the MDR, the Managed Detection and Response System. And there we have about 1.5 billion command line invocations per day across all our customers, which feed into the existing detection and alerting system. So this is the data that we actually want to plug our model into and surface additional alerts. A machine learning based detector is actually the perfect addition here, considering the incoming data volume, because invariably when you have 1.5 billion command lines, there are a few attacks that are like getting through that are probably being missed right now. So having data is not an issue, but often we run into snags when we need to have enough labels. Finding labels for command line data can be a little harder, and it also often becomes a catch-22 problem where, if you have a reliable, quick, and accurate way to label your command lines, then why do you need a machine learning model? To detect LOLBINs, however, we don't have any such quick, reliable systems. So we have to resort to a three-pronged strategy to label the command line data that we've got. So here are the three different strategies that we use to label our data. The simplest source of labels for our problems just lies in past data. Some LOLBIN attacks have already been seen and investigated by the Security Operations Center, and we have that information stored, so we can just directly use it. The second source where we got really creative is indirect labels. Sophos has a lot of different products, and across all these products, we have labeled data for several artifacts like files and URLs. And we can use this information to indirectly label command lines. For example, if a malicious file in a user system also triggers the execution of a malicious command line, there we have an example of a known malicious command line that we can use to augment our training data. And the third strategy that we used is that we now have a dedicated group of threat analysts that are part of Sophos AI, who distill all the information from like the first two sources and all the knowledge that they have, and create rules. These rules can be used for labeling our data. So here's an example of the indirect labeling through a Sophos product that I talked about. Intercept X has something called root cause analysis, where when it finds a malicious file, it constructs a graph of all operations that a triggering file performs on the user system. So this involves like touching files, deleting files, creating processes, and more importantly, running command lines. So we collect a lot of potentially malicious command lines from this data. And here on the slide, you can see an example of like a root cause analysis graph and a command line that we obtained from there that could potentially be malicious. Some other sources for indirect labeling, we use Sandbox behavior reports. One good thing about Sandbox behavior reports is that the detection engine hooks into Windows anti-malware scan interface, which means that it gets access to the actual blob of code that is executing when a command line invocation happens, which means it can get through a lot of issues that obfuscation, or like when you're trying to execute code from a PS1 file, we can't see what the contents of the PS1 file are from the command line itself. So we get a lot of indirect labels from that source. We also do URL lookups, where through the Next-Gen Web product, we have like a repository of URLs that are labeled to be malicious or benign. And if there is an embedded command line, embedded URL within a command line, then we can look up that embedded URL and see if it's something malicious. So like if a command line is operating on a malicious URL, it's more likely that it's going to be malicious. And then the final approach, which is like manual review and labeling through incident investigation data. So here we have our analysts go through incident investigation reports and manually review whether the case was actionable, whether there are associated lolbin command lines in the incident, and then they create rules using regular expressions to capture future occurrences of such commands. And these rules are categorized into 4 different types. So there are strong malicious rules. A malicious rule is given to like a known malicious command line or a known attack, and is given only in cases of really high confidence. Like you can treat this as basically a block list. An example is when, we have a known attack pattern, like a PowerShell command is performing an unsecured download through a very specific port. So that's a good way to like identify that something that we've already seen before is happening on a user system. And then there are suspicious rules. So if command line activity is seen as potentially malicious, but we don't have high enough confidence to completely convict it, then it receives a suspicious label. So an example is like listing credentials, which is suspicious behavior, but could also be legitimate in a different context, such as when a sysadmin is trying to like look at credentials or something. Then we have the other side of the coin, where we have weak benign labels or debatable labels. Potentially benign activity is given this weak benign label, and we think this activity is more likely to be benign, but a machine learning system could potentially FP on it because it's doing something strange, like it has a big base64 encoded chunk in it that a model could see as potentially malicious. And then we have strong benign labels, which is basically known benign activity. And for our machine learning experiments, we basically take the first and last category of rules, the block list and allow list, and augment our labels using these rules. And the suspicious and debatable rules are used in a different way, which I will get to in a different section. So in a nutshell, here's the entire labeling strategy. There are 2 label sources. There are indirect labels that are obtained by cross-referencing command lines. And then there are command lines that are found to be malicious based on incident investigation reports. And then there are human analysts who are looking at both these data sources and creating rules, which are also then used to augment the labels that we have. At the end of this labeling strategy, we end up with a labeled data set, which we can finally use to experiment with different machine learning models. So here are some dataset statistics for the datasets we used to train our machine learning model. We have about 76 million samples in our training set, out of which about 1.6 million are malicious. 7 million samples in the validation set, out of which 70,000 are malicious, and then about 12 million samples in our test set. So importantly here, we use time splitting, and I think my colleague Ben talked about this too in his talk about how it's really important time split, where you're essentially simulating new data. So your model has seen, for example, in this case, the model has seen data till 1st April 2022 in the training set. So when you're trying to validate the model, when you're trying to test its performance, you're not giving it any command lines that it has already seen. So the validation set is created in such a way that there is no overlapping commands, and it contains only the command lines that are seen after 1st April 2022 in our systems. It's the same with the test set, where we collect data from the 1st May of 2022 to the 1st July of 2022. And then we first train a baseline model on this data. We use baseline models as a simple benchmark before training on more complicated models, so that we keep track of how well the actual models are doing and that they're not performing worse than the simplest possible model that we could use. So for this baseline model, we pre-process the command lines, remove white space, decode any base64 encoded chunks, and then develop a feature representation. This feature representation consists of like 3 different parts. We generate summary statistics for the number of transitions between 6 different character classes. We have digits, white space, uppercase vowels, lowercase vowels, uppercase consonants, and lowercase consonants, and we count the number of times in a command line we have transitions between those character classes. So we basically get a 6x6 grid of counts, which we then flatten into 36 different features. We also count the number of occurrences of special tokens, like a PowerShell invoke expression or a $sign that could indicate like that you're trying to use a variable inside a command line. And then the final kind of features is like the number of special symbols that are used in the command line, like opening and closing braces, were there any URLs used, and also we ultimately use the length of the command line. And for the machine learning model, we use a simple XGBoost model for our experiments. So that was the baseline model. And then we also conduct our experiments against 2 convolutional neural networks. In order to provide the command line as an input to these models, though, we need a different kind of feature representation. We first need to convert these characters into integers as a way that the model can consume it. So on the slide, I have a simple example of how we do this with just uppercase alphabets. So if I created an integer representation for alphabets A to Z, where I give them like numbers starting from 1 to 26, then if I have a string that says BSides Las Vegas, I can replace all the characters with the associated integers, replace white space with 0, and then I have a list of numbers that represent that string. The only difference between the feature representation that we develop and the example here is that the size of the vocabulary, or the number of characters we consider, is a lot higher. And for the command lines, we basically consider all printable characters. And these are the two neural network models, the convolutional neural network models that we experiment against. The one on the left is a simpler architecture with a single convolution layer and a small dense layer. And the one on the right is actually a neural network architecture that we have used in the past to detect many different string artifacts like URLs or file paths or registry keys, any string artifacts, basically. So you can read about this model architecture on our site, where one of our data scientists, Salma Tawfiq, has written a great explainer blog post. So I won't go into details of the network architecture here in the interest of time. So these are the model results that we got for the three different models. These are the best results that we've obtained after hyperparameter optimization. If you're unfamiliar with this plot, let me take a quick aside to explain. It's called the receiver operating characteristic curve, or the ROC curve for short. It basically plots the true positive rate on the y-axis against the false positive rate on the x-axis for different thresholds of model score. Let me break that down a little bit. So the true positive rate is the number of correct malicious predictions of a model against the total number of true malicious commands in the data. The false positive rate is the number of false positives as a fraction of the total number of benign samples in the data. So the machine learning models that we train here basically output a score between 0 and 1, with a higher score denoting a greater chance of a command line to be malicious. So when I talk about deciding what threshold to use, that's the value that I'm talking about, where if I decide that anything above 0.5 is what I'm going to consider as malicious, then I'm going to get a different subset of malicious commands detected by the model, as opposed to if I used 0.6. So that's my threshold. So why do false positives happen, and why do the true positive and false positive rates change based on the thresholds that we use for a model? When we train a machine learning model, what it is doing is learning an association between the inputs and the outputs. As we saw in the case of command lines, machine learning models can consume numeric inputs. So we need to create numeric representations for the artifacts that we want the model to predict on. So we can't just supply it with a command line. We need to create a representation for that command line. And in an ideal case, just like on the left, the representation that we chose for our data might make it easy for the model to separate out the good from the bad. Like instead of coming up with 50 numbers, if you came up with 2 numbers that represented your data and plotted it on a scatter plot like that, then if you chose your 2 numbers correctly, ideally you should be able to separate out your good from your bad samples. But unfortunately, this is only an ideal case. And in a real case, the nature of the data itself often does not let you do this. So the real case is much closer to something on the right, which is why if you change your threshold and if you change the location where you draw the line, you get a different false positive rate and you get a different true positive rate. You're basically the optimization problem that you're trying to solve here is whether you are going to bias towards creating more false positives or false negatives. And like I mentioned in our in the goals section before, we definitely do not want to create a lot of false positives, and even if it is at the cost of a few false negatives, we want the system to be more usable, and creating a lot of false positives just makes the whole system useless. So that was a lot of information. So I'm just gonna pause here for a few seconds. This is my dog. His name is Hobbs. I named him after my favorite character in my favorite comic book, Calvin and Hobbes. When I got him, he was supposed to be 5 years old and a lab puppy, but turns out the rescue made a mistake, and he's actually a lab beagle mix. So he's actually an adult and looks like a lab puppy. Now there's a false positive I don't mind. Okay. So we described the machine learning model that we trained. We described the results that we got. A simple question: is this deployable? So what we did was we looked at the output of this model when we plugged it into a 1% sample of our 1.5 billion command line event stream. And this is what happened. This plot basically tells us the number of detections by the machine learning model on a daily basis for like the past 3 weeks. You can see that it's creating hundreds of alerts, which practically makes it unusable because it's very unlikely that there are actually hundreds of living off the land binary attacks happening. So we had a model with a reasonably good accuracy that is doing really poorly. Why is this happening? This doesn't seem like expected behavior, right? Well, this is known as the false positive paradox or the base rate fallacy, and this is commonly seen in a lot of machine learning applications, especially in security. Let's say that we have, let's understand this with an example. Let's say that we have a near perfect ML model, even better than the ML models that I've trained so far. Like I could conduct research for another like 5 years and get the best possible model out there. And let's say it has a true positive rate of 100%, which means that if it ever sees a malicious command, it's always going to detect it as malicious. And the only downside is that out of every 10,000 command lines that it sees, it's going to say that one of them, 10,000 benign command lines it sees, it's going to say that one of them is actually positive. So it's going to make one false positive out of every 10,000 samples. This is a really good model, right? But somehow, if you actually compute the math when plugging into our event stream, it turns out that this model creates, so if we plug into an event stream and assume that there are 150 malicious command lines a day and 1.5 billion benign command lines a day, which is probably close to the real number, and it generates 150 true positives. It has a 100% true positive rate, so it's going to detect every one of those malicious commands. But what happens to the false positives? Since we have 1.5 billion benign commands, even a model that can create only one false positive for every 10,000 samples, it still creates 150,000 false positives. And at that point, like the machine learning model is really not helping the SOC analyst, and the SOC analyst is just going to drown in alerts. And if you do the math, that is one true positive per like 1,001 false positives, which is a terrible model accuracy number. So why does this actually happen? If you notice, if you look at the distribution of malicious versus benign, that is the main culprit here. We have very few malicious commands or a very low base rate of malicious commands compared to the number of benign commands. So hypothetically, if you had a 50-50 distribution, if you had 750 million malicious commands and 750 million benign commands, and you ran them through the same model, that model would produce 750 million malicious detections for 75,000 benign detections, which is really great. It's like 10,000 true positives for every false positive. Right? So yeah, this is the main problem that we face when trying to apply machine learning to this use case. So how do we work around this problem? What is the solution? Is the system completely useless? Have we failed our goals? Well, not quite. There are options. As Josh and others have mentioned before in their talks, deploying ML as a standalone system almost never works, especially in security. And because we always have this kind of skewed data distribution, so what we need are guardrails. We need to control when the machine learning model actually comes into play so that it can contribute where it performs best. So we don't apply it to every single command line that we see, we apply it selectively. What guardrails should we use? Earlier, we talked about using analyst-defined regex rules to augment our labeling, and I alluded to this that we also have suspicious and debatable labels that we use, which is exactly what we use for guardrails in this case. So just to detail the system a little bit here, if we have no rules matching for a given command line, then it doesn't matter what the ML score is. We are just not going to create an alert. Here are some examples where the machine learning model thinks that something is malicious. but there are no regex matches, so we're not going to alert. And if, as you can see, it seems like these are not actual malicious commands. And we also notice that our machine learning model has a bias towards detecting smaller commands as malicious because it has very little information, so it's behaving in an unstable way. And then if any of our strong rules matches, any of our high confidence rules matches, then we don't feel the need to go to the machine learning model to tell us whether something is malicious or benign. We just directly take the output of the rule and we decide whether to surface an alert or not. But the real contribution of the machine learning model comes when there is a suspicious rule that is triggered. So if you remember, a suspicious rule is when there is potentially malicious activity, but we are not entirely sure because in some contexts it could be used in a benign way. So here we use the model to say that if the model scores highly on a command line that triggers a suspicious rule, then we generate an alert. And if not, then we don't generate an alert. We actually create something called a silent detection where we want to review it later. And so we won't surface an alert, but we'll store it in our telemetry for further review. And then we have debatable rules. And again, we do something similar where if there is a debatable rule that is triggered, then we look at the ML verdict. If the machine learning model says that a debatable rule is a command line that triggers a debatable rule is malicious, then we create a silent detection and wait for further review. But if the machine learning model says that something is benign and it triggers a debatable rule, then we don't surface an alert. So that was a lot of information, and I want to put it all together and provide sort of high-level context, just to reiterate, just so you understand all the pieces that go into the system. So during machine learning training, we collect data from the event stream, we clean and sample it, and then source labels from 3 different locations. We have indirect labels, we have parse data, and then we have allow list and block list rules that analysts have created. Using this label dataset, we then train a machine learning model. And then when it comes to prediction, we plug both the machine learning model and the analyst created rules into our system. And we only create alerts in 2 separate scenarios. One of them is if a block list rule is triggered, and the other is if suspicious activity is detected and the machine learning model also detects the same suspicious command line. So we started off saying that we wanted to surface additional alerts into the system while not flooding the SOC. Did we actually meet this goal? This bar plot shows us the total number of unique alerts that we generated per day when this system is deployed. And looks like we certainly create a manageable number of alerts now, at least compared to the previous system. The blue bars here denote the number of alerts that are generated by the block lists, and the orange bars denote the number of alerts that are created by suspicious command lines that are detected by the machine learning model. So it looks like on most days, the system does not create more than 50 alerts. A manageable number of alerts is well and good, but how good are the alerts actually? So it's important to create alerts that are very likely to be malicious because we want to build a SOC analyst trust in our detector. So we want it to be as precise as possible. This plot shows the true positive rate and the false positive rate for the alerts generated by the entire system when plugged into the event stream. Computed on a weekly basis for the past 4 weeks, we see that the true positive rate hovers between 0.9 and 1, which is a pretty good rate of detections, a pretty good precision. Combine this with a manageable number of alerts, and we think we have a very deployable system. The second question, did we actually add value? The plot here shows the number of alerts that were seen in the entire system on a weekly basis for the past 3 weeks. The teal block basically shows the number of alerts that were created by the existing system. The yellow section shows the intersection, which is like the existing system also detected these attacks and our system also detected these attacks. And the blue section, which is the most encouraging, is the new alerts that were surfaced by just our system and weren't surfaced by the existing system. And although this number is small right now, we have nowhere to go but up. And over time, we think that our system should improve significantly and produce more actionable alerts. A big part of our system is the involvement of the Sophos AI analyst team, who have created dashboards that continuously monitor the performance of this system. They then use this information to tweak their rules, catch false positives, and improve the guardrails as a continuous process. And again, this is in line with what Josh talked about and what Ben talked about. It's involving humans in a feedback loop in order to continuously improve performance of our systems. So a quick summary of everything that we talked about in this talk. Low-level attack detection is a hard problem with several challenges. There is a large data volume, there is a low base rate of malicious activity, and labels are hard to come by. We've demonstrated some strategies that we've used to mitigate these problems and work around them. Another important lesson that we learned here is that good data engineering really pays off dividends. We basically went fishing through our data lake and got as much data as possible in order to label our command lines and increase label coverage. We got representative data, we had a good labeling strategy, and we also created good dashboards, performed principled validation and analysis to ensure continuous improvement of our system. Another lesson that we learned here is that the best machine learning models cannot perform well as a standalone system. They need guardrails. And the way forward basically is to integrate rule-based detection and human analysts into the machine learning system and create continuous improvement and feedback loops. And that's all I've got for today. Thank you. Any questions? All right, I'll be around in the room. If you have any questions, you can come up to me and ask me more. Thank you.